October 1943, Pacific Theater. The B-17 Flying Fortress Iron Saint was already limping home when the first Zero appeared out of the glare. At 18,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, the bomber's right outboard engine was running rough from flak damage sustained over Rabaul, oil pressure fluctuating dangerously, while the crew counted the miles back toward Allied-controlled airspace. The fighter escort had peeled away nearly 20 minutes earlier, chasing a separate formation, leaving the bomber temporarily alone. A dangerous isolation in skies known for coordinated Japanese interception tactics. Then the sky began to move. What started as 2 distant glints became 6, then 12. Within seconds, the intercom crackled as the top turret gunner shouted contact reports from multiple bearings. From the waist windows, more silhouettes emerged from high sun and low cloud. They were not random attackers. They were converging. By the time the navigator completed a rough count, 47 Mitsubishi AG-6M-Zeros had formed a tightening perimeter around the lone American bomber, a calculated encirclement rather than a reckless charge. Inside the fuselage, the temperature dropped despite the tropical altitude. The pilot, Captain Harold "Red" Mallory, understood immediately what was happening. The Japanese fighters were establishing layered attack vectors, high, low, frontal, and in rear bow, creating a kill sphere designed to overwhelm the B-17's defensive arcs simultaneously. The Flying Fortress was built for punishment, its .50 caliber machine guns covering overlapping fields of fire, but even the Fortress had limits. 47 fighters meant sustained pressure from every quadrant, forcing the bomber to divide attention and ammunition. In the tail compartment, Staff Sergeant Cole Bennett rotated his twin Browning guns slowly, tracking the widening arc of approaching aircraft. He had flown 17 combat missions. He had never seen this many fighters coordinated against a single bomber. Through the plexiglass cone, he watched the outer ring tighten, Zeros adjusting speed to match the bomber's damaged crews, careful not to close too quickly. They weren't rushing. They were setting geometry. The first attack pass didn't come from behind, but it came from above. 3 Zeros dove in sequence, forcing the top turret to respond, while 2 more climbed under the bomber's belly where defensive coverage thinned. The formation wasn't random chaos, it was a trap being constructed in 3 dimensions. And as the B-17's engines strained against thinning fuel reserves, Bennett realized something that made his stomach tighten. They weren't trying to shoot the bomber down immediately. They were herding it. The second engine began to cough 12 minutes into the encirclement. Not a full failure, not yet, but enough vibration through the airframe to rattle the bombardier's teeth. The Iron Saint was losing speed, and at altitude, speed was survival. A B-17 at 18,000 feet normally cruised near 160 knots indicated, but with one engine compromised and the second running hot. Captain Mallory could feel the drag creeping upward, so the bomber sagging slightly in the air like a wounded animal, trying to hold formation with a pack of predators. "Fuel check," Mallory ordered. The flight engineer's reply was clipped. "We burned heavy on climb. Port tanks lower than projected. We don't have long loiter margin." Loiter margin. That was the polite phrase. It meant they could not circle. They could not climb aggressively. They could not run extended evasive maneuvers without risking flameout before friendly coastline. And the Japanese pilots knew it too. Outside, the Zeros maintained spacing, not attacking en masse, but rotating. 3 would dive, 2 would climb, 4 would feint from port while another pair tested the belly approach. It was coordinated attrition. Force the bomber to fire. Drain ammunition. Probe for weak arcs. Wait for the defensive rhythm to slow. The radio operator attempted to raise Allied patrol sectors. Static answered. The escort fighters were gone, too far east, committed elsewhere, or possibly already engaged. The Iron Saint was alone. Another burst of 20mm cannon fire ripped across the fuselage, punching through the left waist position and shredding insulation along the interior ribs. The waist gunner was thrown backward, but stayed conscious. Hydraulic pressure dropped momentarily before stabilizing. In the tail, Bennett tracked a Zero that held just beyond optimal firing range, shadowing rather than attacking. That pilot wasn't hunting recklessly. He was studying. Bennett's gloved fingers tightened around the twin .50 triggers as he scanned the wider picture. The Japanese formation had shifted subtly. Instead of random arcs, they were shaping into vertical layers, high cover, mid-level strike, low harassment. It was containment, not immediate destruction. They were compressing airspace. Mallory banked gently to test their reaction. The outer ring tightened. The bomber's maneuver radius was shrinking, not expanding. The Zeros were dictating geometry now, and inside the plexiglass cone, Bennett's breathing slowed. 17 missions had taught him something most rookies never grasped. Survival wasn't about shooting faster. It was about recognizing patterns before they locked. And the pattern forming outside wasn't just an attack, it was a three-dimensional cage. Bennett had spent enough hours in the tail to understand that air combat wasn't chaos. It only looked that way to men who reacted instead of observed. From his glass enclosure at the very end of the Iron Saint, he had the clearest panoramic view of the sky, and what he saw now wasn't random aggression. It was geometry tightening. The Zeros weren't attacking in waves to overwhelm immediately. They were spacing themselves at roughly staggered radial distances, each flight adjusting speed to maintain a rotating outer ring. Every time one pair committed to a dive, another pair repositioned high starboard, keeping the bomber boxed inside a shrinking cylinder of controlled airspace. The attacks weren't meant to kill fast. They were meant to herd the B-17 lower, slower, and eventually into coordinated crossfire. Bennett traced their motion with his guns, not firing yet, just studying. Something clicked, and the Japanese formation wasn't just horizontal encirclement. It was vertical stacking, 3 layers, high overwatch, mid-level strike group, low-level harassment cutting off dive escape. It was a kill box, and the center of that box was moving with them. He watched 1 Zero linger just outside firing range again. The same aircraft from earlier. That pilot wasn't interested in quick glory. He was pacing the bomber, adjusting altitude incrementally as if calibrating. And Bennett realized what they were doing. Compressing maneuver options until the B-17 would be forced into a predictable dive or climb, at which point the mid-level ring would converge simultaneously from 4 angles. He leaned into the intercom. "Pilot, they're not swarming. They're steering us." Mallory didn't answer immediately. The cockpit was busy fighting vibrations and keeping altitude stable. Another burst tore through the right wing, shredding fabric control surfaces. The aircraft shuddered again. Bennett kept watching. The outer ring widened slightly on the port side. Barely noticeable, unless you were tracking relative distance. Not a mistake, a funnel. They were leaving an opening, but not for escape, for forced movement. If the B-17 tried to break through the thinner section at current speed, the upper layer would dive in synchronized compression, trapping them between converging attack paths. Bennett visualized it instantly. Crossfire from 3 axes. No stable defensive arc, fuel bleeding away during evasive banking. The realization came cold and precise. If they stayed predictable, they would die slowly. If they tried to run conventionally, they would die quickly. The only survivable move wasn't defensive. It would have to be disruptive, and disruptive meant doing something no bomber crew was trained to attempt. Bennett didn't wait for doctrine. Doctrine would get them killed. He keyed the intercom again, voice steady despite the tremor running through the tail section. "Red, they're building a vertical funnel. That thin gap port side, it's bait. They want us to bank into it." In the cockpit, Mallory's jaw tightened as another zero-stitch tracer fire passed the nose, forcing the bombardier to duck instinctively. The bomber could not outclimb 47 fighters. It could not outrun them. But Bennett understood something the Japanese formation depended on. Predictability. The Zeros were calculating the B-17's expected escape vector based on damage speed and fuel limits. They assumed the bomber would choose the safest-looking corridor. That assumption was the trap. "What are you suggesting?" Mallory asked. Bennett didn't hesitate. "Don't take the gap. Don't climb. Don't level. Push her down hard. Not toward the opening. May straight into the densest quadrant before they compress. Silence followed for half a second, the most dangerous half-second of the mission. A B-17 was not built for aggressive vertical dives at combat weight. The airframe could handle punishment, but a sudden nose-down drop from 18,000 feet risked overspeed stress, structural shear, or blackout conditions for gunners, unprepared for negative G-forces. But Bennett wasn't proposing a blind dive. Canny was proposing disruption, collapsing the geometry before it finished forming. If the Zeros were calibrating relative altitude and closure rate, then a sharp, unexpected vertical break into the heaviest concentration would force them to adjust simultaneously, creating momentary conflict in their firing lanes. Mallory made the decision. All crew brace, nose dropping. The yoke pushed forward. The heavy bomber tilted abruptly, and gravity shifting as loose casings and equipment lifted briefly from the floor before slamming back. The horizon vanished from the cockpit glass. Outside, the Japanese mid-layer strike group hesitated, not because they feared the dive, but because it violated expectation. Instead of fleeing toward the perceived weakness, the Iron Saint plunged towards the most crowded section of the encirclement. For a split second, the kill box geometry cracked, and in that crack, chaos began to grow. The dive hit faster than any of the Japanese pilots expected. A B-17 wasn't supposed to attack downward into density. It was supposed to hold altitude and defend in stable arcs. As the Iron Saint pitched nose down, gravity amplified her speed beyond the carefully calculated closure rates the Zeros had been maintaining. Air screamed over the fuselage as the bomber accelerated, the damaged engine vibrating violently but still holding. Inside the formation, timing shattered. The mid-level strike group that had been preparing a synchronized compression suddenly found the bomber dropping through their altitude band before they could realign vectors. Two Zeros rolled aggressively to adjust, but in doing so crossed into each other's firing lanes, tracers flashing dangerously close to friendly aircraft. What had been a geometric cage became congestion. The outer ring tried to compensate, diving late, but their angles were now misaligned. But instead of converging on a predictable lateral break, they were forced into steep pursuit with narrowing reaction windows. Bennett felt the speed building through the tail structure, the aircraft trembling but alive. At roughly 18,000 feet, the bomber had been vulnerable and slow. Now, in the descent, it was gaining kinetic advantage. Speed in a dive doesn't increase linearly. It compounds under gravity as drag competes with mass and air resistance. In simplified form, so acceleration follows A equals G minus D over M, A equals G minus D over M, A equals G minus D over M, meaning gravity minus drag over mass determines downward acceleration. As velocity increases, drag rises sharply, but in those first critical seconds, the bomber gained speed faster than the Zeros had planned for. Mallory leveled slightly, just enough to prevent structural overspeed, but not enough to stabilize fully. The sudden velocity differential forced pursuing fighters to either commit dangerously steep dives or break off and reposition, but as several committed. That was the second fracture. High-speed pursuit in tight formation reduces lateral separation margins, and one misjudged correction rippled outward. Bennett saw it clearly. A Zero banking left to avoid overshooting clipped the wake turbulence of another diving from above, both aircraft jolting into unstable alignment. Neither collided, but their firing windows evaporated. Now the kill box had inverted. Instead of the B-17 being compressed from all sides, and the Zeros were compressing into each other's maneuver space, and that was something no formation doctrine tolerated well. Gunners in the waist positions began firing controlled bursts into the densest cluster, not to chase individual fighters, but to exploit congestion. Tracers didn't need perfect aim, they only needed to multiply hesitation. For the first time since the encirclement began, the Japanese formation was reacting instead of dictating, and Bennett knew they had only seconds before it reorganized. The moment the Zeros hesitated, Bennett shifted from observation to execution. "Hold the shallow drop, don't level yet," he called forward, understanding that if the Iron Saint stabilized too early, the fighters would regain spacing and rebuild the cage. The bomber was now moving faster than the Japanese pilots had budgeted for, and speed changes everything in aerial combat because engagement windows shrink proportionally to relative velocity. In simplified terms, closing speed follows V relative equals V1 plus V2, V relative equals V1 plus V2 VR, relative equals V1 plus V2, meaning when two aircraft approach head-on or in crossing vectors, their velocities combine, compressing reaction time dramatically. The Zeros diving to recover position suddenly found themselves overshooting their intended firing geometry, forced either to extend forward and circle back, losing coordination, or attempt snap corrections that bled energy and formation discipline. Mallory rolled the bomber slightly starboard while maintaining downward momentum, a calculated imbalance that exposed one flank momentarily, but brought three defensive gun positions into overlapping arcs. The waist gunners adjusted instantly, not spraying randomly but firing short, intersecting bursts into the densest traffic where multiple fighters were converging. The key wasn't precision kills, it was saturation of shared airspace. Tracers stitched through the compressed cluster, and because the Zeros were lighter, faster, and more maneuverable individually, they depended on clear maneuver corridors. Those corridors were now cluttered by their own teammates, struggling to reposition. Bennett picked his targets carefully. Instead of chasing the closest aircraft, he focused on the stabilizers, the fighters attempting to re-establish outer ring structure. He fired controlled bursts not at cockpit centers, but slightly ahead of their projected roll paths, forcing them to break earlier than planned. Each premature break widened the disorder. Inside the formation, Japanese pilots began making independent survival decisions instead of synchronized ones. That was the pivot. The B-17, designed as a defensive fortress, had momentarily turned into a disruption engine, using gravity and coordinated arcs to fracture a numerically superior force. But the chaos would not last long. Experienced squadron leaders adapt quickly. Bennett could already see two Zeros climbing aggressively to reassert high cover dominance and rebuild vertical layering. The window was narrowing. The bomber had traded altitude for speed, and fuel gauges were ticking downward. They had cracked the cage, but they hadn't escaped it yet. Bennett saw the reorganization forming before anyone else did. Two Zeros had climbed sharply above the chaos, separating themselves from the congestion below. They weren't chasing the bomber. They were stabilizing the formation. One of them held slightly back, wings steady, nose dipping only enough to maintain visual command of the cluster beneath. That wasn't an aggressive pursuit posture, it was leadership. Every time the lower group wavered, that aircraft adjusted position subtly, re-establishing vertical spacing. If the Japanese formation regained layered control, the cage would reform within seconds. Bennett exhaled slowly and stopped firing at the nearest threats. Instead, he tracked the high cover Zero. Shooting at distance from a vibrating tail section required more than reflex. It required predictive geometry. The fighter was crossing left to right relative to the bomber's descent vector, maintaining a shallow downward arc to keep oversight. In deflection shooting, the gunner doesn't aim at where the target is. He aims at where it will be. In simplified ballistic terms, horizontal displacement follows dA equals V times. TD equals V times T equals V out times T, meaning distance equals velocity multiplied by time. Bennett calculated subconsciously fighter speed relative to dive angle, bullet travel time from twin point 5 OS, wind resistance at altitude. The lead required was greater than instinct suggested. He squeezed the triggers, not in a long spray, but in two disciplined bursts, and the first stitch just behind the Zero's tail, forcing a micro-correction. The second burst adjusted forward by a fraction, anticipating that correction. Tracers climbed through the fighter's projected path, and for a split second nothing happened. Then a flash erupted near the engine cowling. Smoke streamed instantly from the Zero's nose. The aircraft rolled violently, losing altitude control, and clipped dangerously close to another climbing fighter, before spiraling downward in a widening arc. The effect was immediate. Without the high cover stabilizer, The mid-level Zeros hesitated again, unsure whether to recommit to compression or disengage to regroup. In coordinated air tactics, leadership aircraft often function as visual timing anchors. Remove the anchor, and synchronization collapses. Several fighters broke off simultaneously instead of maintaining rotational pressure. The others overcorrected. The carefully reconstructed vertical layer disintegrated before it could fully reform. Inside the Iron Saint, no one cheered. There was no time, but Mallory felt the shift in the air. The pressure had changed. The bomber's arcs were no longer surrounded by organized geometry. They were facing fragmented aggression. Bennett reloaded calmly, knowing that the single shot had not won the battle, but it had removed the brain from the swarm. And without a brain, even 47 fighters could hesitate. The moment the high-cover Zero spiraled downward, Mallory committed to the second half of the maneuver. Leveling in 3-2, the Iron Saint eased out of the steep descent just above structural stress limits, airspeed dangerously high but still within survivable tolerance. They had traded altitude for velocity, and now velocity had to become distance. Heading 210, we punched through the south quadrant. It wasn't the thinnest part of the swarm anymore. It was the most disorganized. And that was the difference. Instead of flying toward an obvious gap, they were flying toward confusion. Several Zeros reacted immediately, diving after them, but without synchronized altitude, layering their attack windows overlapped awkwardly. Two fighters attempted a frontal convergence, but misjudged closure speed against the bomber's regained forward thrust. The damaged engine screamed under strain, yet the other three held, propellers biting dense air as the bomber pushed through turbulence created by dozens of intersecting flight paths. Tracers sliced across the nose. A 20-millimeter shell detonated near the left wing root, showering fragments through the fuselage and knocking out one waist gun temporarily, but the crew stayed in rhythm. Short bursts, overlapping arcs, controlled fire discipline. Fuel gauges ticked lower. The engineer called out numbers no one liked hearing. They could not sustain prolonged maneuvering, and this push had to work. Bennett scanned the rear hemisphere, firing only when a pursuing fighter committed fully instead of shadowing. 1-0 lined up directly astern at close range. Too close. Bennett waited until the fighter's nose filled his sight picture, then fired a tight burst that forced it to break violently upward, overshooting into the wake turbulence. That turbulence, generated by the heavy bomber's disturbed airflow, destabilized the lighter fighter just long enough for it to abandon pursuit. Ahead, cloud cover began to form, broken layers at lower altitude, not thick enough to hide completely but sufficient to disrupt visual coordination. Mallory angled toward the densest bank without climbing back into organized altitude layers. The remaining Zeros hesitated at the cloud edge. Pursuing into fragmented visibility meant losing visual references on one another. A dangerous proposition. After formation, cohesion had already fractured. A few committed half-heartedly, firing through vapor and pulling away. Others disengaged entirely, climbing back toward safer altitude. For the first time since the encirclement began, open sky appeared on three sides of the Iron Saint. They were no longer trapped, yet they were running, and the sky behind them was finally widening instead of closing. The Iron Saint crossed back into Allied radar coverage with less than 12 minutes of safe fuel remaining. The right outboard engine failed completely during descent toward base, windmilling uselessly as Mallory feathered the prop to reduce drag. Hydraulic pressure flickered, but held long enough for landing gear extension. When the bomber finally touched the coral strip runway, she did not roll smoothly. She staggered, one tire bursting on impact from flak fragment damage sustained earlier. No, but she stopped, and every crewman walked off under his own power. Debrief lasted longer than the flight. Intelligence officers initially struggled to reconcile the gun camera footage and crew reports. 47 interceptors against a single bomber. A deliberate dive into density. A fragmentation of layered attack geometry. Bennett's deflection burst, eliminating what analysts later identified as a flight leader aircraft. And what fascinated them wasn't just survival. It was the disruption of an emerging tactic. Japanese interceptor doctrine in the Pacific had been evolving from aggressive swarm assaults toward structured altitude-layered kill zones designed to exhaust heavy bombers methodically. The Iron Saint had broken that geometry not by defensive endurance, but by collapsing it at the moment of compression. Post-mission analysis mapped the engagement on large plotting boards. Officers traced altitude bands, projected intercept angles, and closure rates. One detail stood out repeatedly: the unexpected vertical dive at the precise moment the encirclement stabilized. Had the bomber attempted a conventional break toward the perceived weak quadrant, crossfire convergence would likely have succeeded. Instead, by accelerating downward and forcing simultaneous vector correction among tightly packed fighters, the crew introduced airspace congestion into a formation that depended on clean separation. When Bennett removed the high-cover stabilizer aircraft, coordination failed entirely. The official report did not romanticize the event. It categorized it clinically: defensive disruption via vertical aggression. But within Pacific bomber groups, word traveled faster than paperwork. Crews began discussing the maneuver informally, not as reckless bravado, but as recognition that predictable defensive patterns made them easier to herd. In subsequent months, several bomber squadrons trained specifically on aggressive altitude breaks when facing layered encirclement. The sky did not become safer, but it became less one-sided. Bennett never described it as heroism. In later interviews, he would say only that he didn't like the way the sky looked that day. But analysts understood something larger. A single decision in the tail of a damaged bomber had forced a tactical rethink in how heavy aircraft responded to numerical superiority. 47 fighters had built a cage in the sky. One gunner had broken it.